Hey, what's going on, everyone? I need to talk to you about something absolutely explosive that just emerged from Los Angeles. Right now, as I'm recording this, the entire baseball world is trying to process what could be the most significant crisis in modern sports history. Shohei Ohtani, the player who redefined what's possible in baseball, the man with a $700 million contract, is reportedly at a breaking point with the Dodgers. And what we're learning about why this is happening should honestly terrify every single person who cares about this sport. Before we get into the details, I want you to understand something. This isn't about performance. This isn't about money in the traditional sense. This is about what happens when an organization forgets that the person generating billions of dollars for them is still human. What's coming out right now through multiple sources, including reported statements from Ohtani's wife, Mamiko Tanaka, paints a picture of systematic exploitation disguised as franchise management. And the really disturbing part is how long this has apparently been building without any of us truly understanding what was happening behind closed doors. Let me walk you through exactly what we know happened on November 1st. Ohtani himself requested an emergency meeting with Dodgers leadership. Not a scheduled check-in, not a contract discussion, but an urgent closed-door conference that lasted over 2 hours. What made this meeting so unusual was who wasn't there. No agent, no legal counsel, no marketing representatives, just Ohtani and the people running the organization. Multiple sources have since confirmed that during this meeting, Ohtani expressed his desire to explore options for exiting his historic contract, entirely not requesting a trade, not asking for renegotiation, seeking complete withdrawal from the agreement that was supposed to define the next decade of baseball. Think about what that means for a second. A player who chose Los Angeles specifically, who deferred almost his entire salary to help the team build a championship roster, who has performed at an absolutely superhuman level, wanting out less than a year into the deal. Something catastrophically wrong had to happen for us to reach this point. And according to emerging reports, that something was a systematic pattern of broken promises and organizational pressure that gradually destroyed Ohtani's trust in the people who promised to protect his career. The Dodgers' immediate response has been telling in its absence. No official statement, no press conference, just emergency meetings involving the entire front office, coaching staff, and apparently crisis management consultants brought in to handle what insiders are calling strategic code. Red Dave Roberts has gone almost completely silent beyond mandatory post-game obligations. The organization that usually controls every aspect of its public narrative has been caught completely off guard, scrambling to contain a situation that threatens not just their championship window, but their entire financial foundation. Now here's where this gets really interesting, and honestly pretty disturbing. On the field, Ohtani has continued performing at an elite level. Just days before this crisis exploded into public view, he crushed his 33rd home run of the season against Milwaukee, a 448-foot absolute missile that reminded everyone why he's the most feared hitter in baseball. He's leading or near the top in virtually every major offensive category. 60 RBIs, batting average that until very recently was rock solid. From the outside, everything looked fine. But that's exactly the problem. The facade of normalcy was masking a situation that had become completely unsustainable. What apparently broke the silence was Mamiko Tanaka. According to reports that surfaced this week, she confirmed that Ohtani has been dealing with intense, long-term personal pressure that goes far beyond normal professional demands. The specific phrase that keeps appearing in these reports is management overload, not just managing his performance, but aggressive oversight of his private life, his daily environment, his personal schedule, everything. The implication is that the Dodgers operation had become so invasive, so controlling, that Ohtani felt he was losing autonomy over his own existence, and apparently this intensified dramatically after the All-Star break. Sources close to the situation describe an exponential increase in mandatory obligations starting in July. More training sessions, more media appearances, more promotional events and sponsor commitments. The two-way workload was already unprecedented in modern baseball, but on top of that, Ohtani was being pushed into what essentially amounts to a second full-time job, serving the commercial interest that his presence generates every day. Something required his attention. Every week, multiple appearances that had nothing to do with baseball, but everything to do with maximizing the return on the Dodgers' investment. The human being was disappearing beneath the brand asset. According to the same reports, Mamiko indicated that Ohtani has discussed stepping away from top-tier baseball entirely multiple times in recent months, not just leaving the Dodgers, but potentially returning to Japan, where the pressure and scrutiny might be more manageable, or even exploring options in less visible leagues where he could actually have something resembling a normal life. For someone who loves baseball as much as Ohtani clearly does, the fact that he's been considering walking away from the highest level of competition tells you everything about how desperate the situation had become. This is happening against the backdrop of a team that's simultaneously falling apart. The Dodgers just endured a 6-game losing streak, their worst stretch in years. After their most recent loss, Dave Roberts literally stood at the podium unable to articulate a coherent explanation for what's happening. But even more revealing was Miguel Rojas completely losing his filter with reporters. Rojas openly stated that this is the price we pay for relying too much on Shohei Ohtani. He argued that the front office should have invested more heavily in depth pieces specifically to give Ohtani the rest he needs, emphasizing that no matter how great someone is, they're still human and have physical limits. A veteran player publicly criticizing organizational philosophy. That specifically is a massive red flag. Now we get to the contractual bombshell that apparently sits at the center of this entire crisis. ESPN reported something this week that almost nobody knew existed. Embedded in Ohtani's 10-year deal were specific, legally binding rest provisions. These weren't suggestions or general guidelines. These were mandatory requirements that the Dodgers explicitly agreed to when signing the contract, 7 days of complete rest following each pitching rotation. 1 to 2 full days off in February where he wouldn't even be at the facility. Scheduled games where he would not be in the lineup at all, not as a pitcher, not as a designated hitter, completely inactive to allow for recovery. The Dodgers signed off on all of this, acknowledging that protecting the only true two-way player in modern baseball history required exceptional measures. Except according to multiple sources, those provisions became effectively meaningless once other players started hitting the injured list. Mookie Betts, Trea Turner, Max Muncy, Teoscar Hernandez, one injury after another, decimated the roster depth. And as the team's situation became more desperate, the rest days Ohtani was contractually guaranteed started disappearing. First a day here or there, then entire scheduled rest periods completely ignored. The internal justification was apparently straightforward survival. Without Ohtani in the lineup every single day, the season was going to collapse. So the contract stipulations, the promises made to secure his signature, were quietly discarded as inconvenient obstacles to short-term necessity. The physical toll is becoming visible now. Ohtani's on-base percentage has dropped, his strikeout rate has increased, his overall batting average has slipped to .279 after being above .290 for months. These aren't massive collapses, but for someone who maintains the ridiculous standards Ohtani sets for himself, they represent real decline. More concerning are the observable changes in his mechanics and demeanor. Analysts who study his swing frame by frame have noted subtle alterations consistent with cumulative fatigue. His body language in the dugout, normally engaged and energetic, has become more withdrawn and distant. The machine was breaking down, and the people responsible for maintaining it just kept pushing harder. This all came to a head in what's being described as an absolutely explosive confrontation at Dodgers headquarters. Nez Balelo, Ohtani's agent and one of the most powerful figures in baseball representation, demanded an emergency meeting with senior executives. This wasn't scheduled through normal channels. This was Balelo essentially forcing his way into the building and demanding immediate accountability. What happened in that room apparently shocked even hardened front office veterans. Bolello reportedly started calm, but within minutes was shouting, at one point slamming his hand on the conference table. The phrase that keeps appearing in accounts from people who were there or spoke to people who were there is him asking, "Do you view Shohei as nothing more than a machine designed to generate revenue?" Bolello apparently laid out in explicit detail how the systematic violation of the rest clauses was destroying not just Ohtani's immediate performance, but potentially his long-term career viability. He warned that the organization's disregard for their contractual obligations had fundamentally broken the trust that any successful partnership requires. This wasn't a negotiation. This was Bolello putting the Dodgers on notice that continued violations would result in actions that would permanently sever the relationship. The executives tried to defend themselves by pointing to the roster situation and the competitive necessity of using their best player, but Bolello apparently cut them off, making it clear that business justifications don't override legal commitments. Then they made what might have been a critical mistake. According to sources, executives tried to flip the argument by emphasizing the commercial reality of Ohtani's value to the organization. They pointed to specific data. And this is where we get to something that really exposes the ugly economics driving all of this. Remember back in April when Ohtani used paternity leave to be present for the birth of his first child? Beautiful moment, right? Universally celebrated by fans as Ohtani prioritizing family. But behind the scenes, that 3-game absence apparently triggered absolute panic in the Dodgers' business operations office. During that road series against Texas, attendance dropped by over 40% compared to season averages. Not 40% below capacity, 40% below what games were normally drawing, even with Mookie Betts, Freddie Freeman, and the rest of the star-studded lineup. People didn't show up because Ohtani wasn't there. One commentator summarized it perfectly. No Ohtani, no audience. But it wasn't just ticket sales. Merchandise revenue cratered. Television ratings dropped. The entire economic engine that the Dodgers have built around Ohtani's presence suddenly revealed how completely dependent they are on one person. The franchise wasn't just using him as their best player, he had become their entire business model. So when executives brought this up in the meeting with Bolello, they were essentially arguing that respecting Ohtani's contractual rights was financially impossible. The organization couldn't afford to give him rest because the revenue loss would be catastrophic. Think about how insane that argument is. We can't honor our legal commitments because honoring them would cost us too much money. That's not a defense. That's an admission of exploitation. You built a system where one person's constant presence is mandatory for survival, and then you're surprised when that person eventually says this is unsustainable. Bolello apparently left that meeting without speaking to anyone. He walked straight through the assembled media outside the building, got in his car, and drove away. But before leaving the conference room, according to someone who was present, he delivered a final message to the executives that people are describing as chilling in its implications. If you are incapable of handling this internally, then we will be forced to handle it ourselves. That's not a negotiating position, that's a threat. And given Bolello's reputation and track record, it's a threat that should be taken extremely seriously. The financial implications of this situation are almost impossible to fully calculate. Ohtani's contract includes $680 million in deferred payments, a structure that's unprecedented in professional sports history and creates complex legal obligations stretching decades into the future. If that contract were to be terminated or voided due to organizational breach, the resulting legal battle would potentially reshape how player contracts are structured across all of baseball. But beyond the direct financial hit to the Dodgers, there's the broader commercial ecosystem. Over 40 brand partnerships, international broadcasting agreements, licensing deals, all built on the assumption that Ohtani would be a Dodger for the next decade. The destruction of that assumption would send shockwaves through the entire industry. What's happening right now represents a fundamental test of priorities in modern professional sports. On one side, you have organizational and commercial imperatives. Teams invest billions building franchises. They operate under competitive pressure to win. They have financial obligations to ownership and stakeholders. The business of baseball is enormous and complex and requires constant revenue generation. On the other side, you have a human being who happens to be extraordinarily gifted at playing a game, someone who works harder than almost anyone in professional sports, who performs at a level we've never seen before, but who also has limits and needs and a life beyond his commercial value. The question this crisis is forcing everyone to confront is pretty simple. Where's the line? At what point does maximizing return on investment become exploitation? When does using your best asset become abusing that asset? The Dodgers clearly believe that Ohtani's unique talent and market appeal meant they could push beyond normal boundaries. They convinced themselves that someone operating at his level could handle demands that would destroy a normal player. But what's becoming clear is that even someone with Ohtani's physical gifts and mental toughness has breaking points. And when you systematically ignore the protections built into a contract specifically to prevent those breaking points from being reached, you create exactly the crisis we're watching unfold right now. For the last 72 hours, according to sources, there have been intense behind-the-scenes negotiations between Ohtani's team and Dodgers leadership. These aren't public discussions. These are desperate attempts to pull back from a cliff that both sides can see approaching. The Dodgers apparently now understand the existential threat they're facing. Losing Ohtani wouldn't just hurt their championship chances. It would fundamentally damage the franchise's value and reputation potentially for years. But Ohtani's side seems to have realized that they have leverage that goes beyond normal player-team dynamics. When you're the person generating billions in value, when your absence literally empties stadiums, you have power to demand changes that most players could never secure. What's emerged from these negotiations is apparently a completely restructured approach to how Ohtani will be managed going forward. The Dodgers have reportedly agreed to immediately and strictly enforce all of the rest provisions that were in the original contract, not when it's convenient, not when the roster is healthy, but mandatorily regardless of circumstances. They've also agreed to something that's being called a shadow schedule, where Ohtani will be removed from the designated hitter slot for predetermined stretches and used only in extremely limited defensive or base-running roles. This eliminates the commercial draw of having him in the lineup while maximizing physical recovery time. But here's the really interesting part. To address the core issue that rest periods hurt revenue, a new provision has apparently been added. If attendance or gate revenue drops below specific thresholds during Ohtani's scheduled rest periods, the Dodgers have to compensate a charitable foundation designated by Ohtani's family for the shortfall. This is actually brilliant if it's structured correctly. It transforms rest from a financial penalty into a managed organizational obligation. The team can no longer use revenue concerns as justification for overusing him because they're going to bear that cost either way. It forces them to find ways to maintain fan engagement without being completely dependent on one player's constant presence. What we're watching is not the departure of a superstar, it's the constitutional restructuring of how that superstar is treated. Ohtani didn't quit, he didn't demand a trade, he didn't take the nuclear option. Instead, he used the leverage of his position to force systematic changes that should protect not just him, but potentially other elite players in the future. He proved that an athlete can dictate terms to an organization and a league that tried to commodify him. That even in a sport dominated by ownership and front office power, a player with sufficient value can push back against exploitation and win. The message this sends to Major League Baseball should be absolutely clear. Athletes are not infinite resources. Talent cannot be endlessly extracted without consequence. The machine must adapt to the humanity of its stars, not the other way around. For years, we've watched sports organizations treat players as assets to be maximized, bodies to be used until they break and then replaced. What Ohtani is doing right now is drawing a line and saying that approach stops here. With me, you're going to do things differently, not because it's more profitable, but because it's the only sustainable way forward. The Dodgers now have a path forward, but it's a path that requires them to fundamentally rethink their operational philosophy. They can't just be a team that signed Shohei Ohtani. They have to be an organization worthy of having Shohei Ohtani. That means sometimes making decisions that hurt in the short term, sometimes taking revenue losses to protect long-term health, sometimes admitting that your initial approach was wrong, and making corrections even when it's uncomfortable. Whether they can actually execute that kind of transformation remains to be seen. For Ohtani himself, this has to be exhausting beyond anything most of us can imagine. Playing baseball at the highest level while pitching and hitting is already unprecedented physical demand. Dealing with the pressure of being the face of global baseball adds massive psychological weight. But now also having to fight your own organization just to get the rest you were promised. Having to watch your wife speak publicly about your struggles, having to put your agent in position to threaten the people you work for, that's a completely different level of stress. The fact that he's still performing at an elite level through all of this is actually kind of remarkable, and probably also evidence of exactly why he needs the protections he's fighting for. What happens next is going to define not just Ohtani's career, but possibly the next era of player management relations across professional sports. If this restructured approach actually works, if the Dodgers can figure out how to win while respecting reasonable human limits, it creates a template. Other players, other agents, they'll point to this as proof that there's a better way. But if this falls apart, if the Dodgers backslide into old patterns, or if the relationship is too damaged to repair, then we're looking at the most expensive divorce in sports history and probably litigation that stretches for years. Right now, the baseball world is holding its breath. Fans in Los Angeles are probably terrified. Fans of other teams are watching with morbid fascination. Agents and players across the league are paying very close attention because the precedents being set here affect everyone. And somewhere in all of this, there's a 29-year-old who just wants to play baseball at the highest level without being crushed by the weight of everything surrounding that act. Whatever your feelings about player salaries or contract structures or organizational management, this situation should concern you if you care about baseball, because what we're watching is a test of whether the sport can adapt to protect its greatest talents or whether it's structurally committed to consuming them. Shohei Ohtani might be the most valuable player in baseball history, but he's also revealing the limits of a system built on endless extraction. And honestly, it's about time someone with his platform forced this conversation into the open. That's where we are. Everything is in flux. Nothing is resolved. And the only certainty is that baseball will never quite be the same after this.